Your kid runs into the kitchen tonight and swears there's a shadow man standing in the closet. You sigh. You tell them it's not real. You tell them to go back to bed. But the real answer to what's happening in that moment is far stranger than a bedtime lie. For most of human history, a child saying they saw a spirit wasn't automatically treated as a lie at all. It was treated as a claim that had to be tested. Your ancestors didn't grow up in a world that assumed the supernatural was false. They grew up in a world where most adults already believed spirits, ancestors, and unseen forces were part of daily life. So when a child said something was watching me from the trees, the first question wasn't, why are you lying? The first question was, what did you actually see? That single shift changes everything about how ancient discipline worked. Psychologist Jean Piaget spent decades studying how children think about the world, and he found something researchers still build on today. Young children move through a stage where they don't cleanly separate imagination from reality. A shadow can be a shadow and a spirit at the same time, and the child isn't being dishonest. Their brain hasn't finished building the wall between the two. Modern researcher Marjorie Taylor, who has spent her career studying imaginary companions, found that the majority of children invent invisible friends, hidden watchers, or unseen creatures at some point in early childhood. It's not a warning sign. It's a normal function of a developing mind that is learning to model minds it can't see. So here's the strange part. In a lot of ancient and traditional societies, that overlap between imagination and belief wasn't punished. It was expected. Anthropologist Melvin Konner, who spent years documenting childhood among hunter-gatherer groups like the Kalahari San, described childhoods with far less direct punishment than most people assume. Discipline in these communities rarely looked like a modern parent scolding a child for telling a story. It looked like correction through the group. An elder might simply ask the child to describe the spirit again, in more detail. Not to catch them lying. To see what they'd actually experienced, and to place it inside the community's existing understanding of the world. If the child's story lined up with known local beliefs, it was often accepted, at least partly. If it didn't, the response usually wasn't punishment. It was retelling. Adults would offer the correct version of what the spirit meant, gently overriding the child's account with the shared cultural one. This is where things get genuinely uncomfortable to think about, because ancient discipline for spirit claims wasn't really about truth or falsehood at all. It was about whether the claim served the community or disrupted it. Historian and anthropologist David Lancy, who has spent decades studying childhood across cultures, points out that in many traditional societies, children's fantastical claims were tolerated right up until they started to interfere with work, safety, or social order. A child who said a spirit lived by the river and refused to fetch water there might be humored for a while, but if that fear kept disrupting daily chores, the response shifted. Elders would often stage a small ritual, walk the child to the river themselves, and demonstrate that the water could be approached safely. The claim wasn't argued with directly. It was quietly disproven through action. That's strikingly different from how a modern parent handles it. You tend to argue with the claim itself. There's no such thing as monsters. Ancient discipline more often argued with the consequences of the claim. You still have to fetch the water. But there was a harder edge to this too. Anthropologist Barry Hewlett, who studied the Aka people of Central Africa, documented that while corporal punishment was rare, social punishment was not. Ridicule, teasing, and public correction by the group were far more common tools than physical discipline. A child who kept insisting on a spirit citing mainly to get out of an unwanted task, rather than out of genuine fear, would often be exposed through gentle mockery by older children or adults. Not cruelty exactly, more like social pressure designed to make the manipulation not worth repeating. There was also a third possibility ancient communities had to account for, one that modern parenting rarely considers at all. Sometimes the child wasn't lying, and wasn't simply afraid either. Sometimes the claim was taken as a sign of something else entirely. Historian of religion Mircea Eliade, who studied shamanic traditions across Siberia, Central Asia, and the Americas, documented that in many of these cultures, a child who repeatedly reported visions or spirit contact wasn't automatically disciplined at all. They were watched. In some communities, persistent spirit sight in a young child was treated as an early marker of a future shaman or healer, someone whose mind was thought to sit closer to the unseen world than most. The response wasn't correction. It was observation, sometimes followed by informal mentorship from an older spiritual practitioner in the group. That single possibility completely changes the stakes of the situation. A modern parent hears, "I saw a spirit," and reaches for reassurance or correction. Some ancient communities heard the exact same sentence and asked a completely different question. Is this child ordinary? Or is this child something the group needs to pay closer attention to? Folklore did a lot of the disciplinary work that direct punishment might otherwise have had to do. Nearly every culture on record has some version of a threatening figure invoked specifically to shape a child's behavior around fear of the unseen, a watching spirit, a night creature, a figure who knows when a child has misbehaved. Anthropologists studying oral tradition have long noted that these figures function less as literal beliefs to be argued over and more as portable tools, stories an adult could invoke in the moment instead of resorting to physical punishment. If your child already believed something might be watching from the dark, an elder didn't need to argue that belief away to use it. They simply pointed out what the watcher was said to dislike and let the child's own fear do the disciplining. This matters because it points to something researchers have confirmed again and again. Children can tell the difference between a fear they genuinely feel and a story they're using strategically earlier than most adults assume. Psychologist Kang Lee, who has spent his career studying how lying develops in children, found that by around age 4, most children have already developed the basic cognitive tools to deceive on purpose. Not fully, not smoothly, but the capacity is there. Which means ancient communities weren't naive about the difference between a frightened child and a manipulative one. They just handled the two very differently. A child who seemed genuinely afraid was rarely punished. They were reassured, sometimes through ritual, sometimes through a trusted elder, simply sitting with them until the fear passed. A child who used a spirit story as a tool to avoid work, to get attention, to shift blame, was met with something closer to social embarrassment than punishment. The goal wasn't to make the child confess a lie. It was to make the strategy stop working. There's a reason this distinction mattered so much in small communities. Cognitive scientist Bruce Hood has written extensively about what he calls the human tendency to detect agency where none exists, a kind of built-in alarm system that assumes rustling grass might be a predator rather than just wind. It's a survival trait. It kept your ancestors alive far more often than it embarrassed them. A child who reacts to a strange sound with genuine fear of a hidden presence isn't malfunctioning, and ancient parents weren't dealing with a broken child when a kid claimed to see a spirit. They were dealing with a brain doing exactly what it evolved to do, filtered through a culture that hadn't yet drawn a hard line between the seen and the unseen world. The discipline, when it came, wasn't really aimed at the belief. It was aimed at what the belief was being used for. Tell the truth about your fear, and you were folded gently back into the group's shared story about the world. Use the fear as a weapon to dodge responsibility, and the group had ways of making that very uncomfortable to repeat. There's one more layer worth sitting with here, because it explains why so much of this discipline looked social rather than physical. Anthropologists who study the difference between guilt-based and shame-based cultures point out that many small, close-knit ancient communities relied on shame, not private guilt, as their primary tool for shaping behavior. In a group where everyone lived within earshot of everyone else, a child didn't need to be struck to feel the weight of doing something wrong. Being gently mocked at the fire, or having an older sibling retell the spirit story with an exaggerated, foolish version of the child's fear, did the same job punishment might have done elsewhere. It cost nothing, it required no tools, and it worked because the child's sense of self was already deeply tied to how the group saw them. That's very different from how a lot of modern discipline works. Isolated, one-on-one, often happening behind a closed bedroom door with no audience at all. Ancient discipline for a spirit claim was rarely private. It happened in front of the fire, in front of siblings, in front of the whole small world the child belonged to. The correction wasn't just about the child and the claim. It was about the child and their place in the group. Somewhere between those two responses is a lesson most modern parenting advice has quietly forgotten. You don't have to argue a child out of believing in monsters to stop them from using monsters as an excuse. You just have to notice which one you're actually dealing with. Tonight, when your kid swears there's a shadow man in the closet, you'll probably still tell them it's not real. But somewhere underneath that reflex is a much older instinct, the same one your ancestors carried around every fire for 100,000 years. Not the instinct to prove the shadow wrong, the instinct to ask, first, what your child actually saw.